The road below Marrow Hill had been washed to ruts by 3 days of rain, and on the 4th morning the post-chaise carrying Eleanor Vane went down the embankment in a slow, terrible turn that no one on the empty road was near enough to see. The horses screamed and tore loose. The body of the carriage struck the stone wall at the bend, splintered and came to rest on its side in the ditch, with one wheel still spinning above her. She lay in the wreck of cushions and broken glass for a long moment, listening to the rain find its way through the cracked panel, and she understood with a strange, clear calm that no one was coming. The family she had been traveling toward had sent the chaise. They had not sent a single man to ride alongside it. She was not yet 24, and she had learned already that the world kept a separate ledger for women like her, women without fortune and without protectors, and that the ledger was rarely read aloud but always settled. To the household at Marrow Hill, she was the poor relation summoned to be useful, the orphaned cousin whose mother had married beneath her, the girl who could be sent for in bad weather because her comfort cost nothing and her absence would be noticed by no one. If you have ever felt yourself counted as a convenience rather than a person, stay with this one. I think you will want to see how it ends. Eleanor pulled herself free of the broken door because there was no one to pull her free. Her left wrist would not bear her weight, and a long cut along her brow filled her eye with warmth she had to keep wiping away, and her good half-boot had been lost somewhere in the dark of the overturned carriage. She climbed the slick embankment on her knees and one hand. At the top, she stood in the road in the rain and looked in the direction of the great house she could not yet see, and she waited for the sound of hooves, of wheels, of any soul sent to find her. The road stayed empty. The rain came down. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows a dog barked twice and then thought better of it. The man who eventually came down that road was not from Marrow Hill at all. He came from the other direction entirely, from the cold gray pile of stone known across 3 counties as Ashcombe, and he was the last man in England anyone would have expected to be abroad in such weather. Gabriel Thorne, the Duke of Ashcombe, did not ride out in the rain. He did not ride out at all if he could help it. For 2 years, he had kept to his own grounds with the discipline of a man who had decided that the world had taken from him everything it was going to be permitted to take. That he was on the Marrow Road that morning was an accident of a tenant's flooded cottage and a steward's urgent message, and accidents, he would later reflect, were the only doors grief had ever left unlocked. He saw her before she saw him, a woman standing alone in the middle of a washed-out road, one shoe gone, her gray traveling gown black with water to the knee, her hair come loose and plastered to a face streaked with blood and rain. She was not weeping. That was the first thing he noticed, the thing that made him rein in hard enough that his horse threw its head. She was not weeping, and she was not waving for help. She was simply standing, very upright, looking down the road as though she still expected someone to appear on it, and the dignity of that futile waiting struck him somewhere he had walled off long ago. "You are hurt," he said, and it was not a question. He was already down from the saddle, already crossing to her through the standing water, and his voice when it reached her was low and level, and entirely without the pity she had braced herself to refuse. "The carriage went into the ditch," Eleanor said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "The horses bolted. I am not gravely injured. I am only trying to determine which direction is Marrow Hill, for they will be expecting me." Something moved across his face then, brief as a cloud shadow. "Marrow Hill expected you in a storm like this, and sent no outrider. They sent the chaise," she said, as though that settled it, as though the chaise were the same as care. "Come away from the road," he said. "You are standing in the open, in the cold, and you cannot feel it yet, which means you will feel it badly in an hour. Come." She did not move at once. She had spent her whole adult life learning to refuse the help of men, because the help of men came with a reckoning, and she was already composing the polite deflection when she registered that he was not waiting for her permission, and not somehow demanding her gratitude. He had simply taken off his greatcoat, heavy and dark and warm from his body, and settled it around her shoulders, and the weight of it was so unexpected that her composure cracked for exactly one breath before she gathered it shut again. He saw the crack. He said nothing of it. He led his horse with one hand and walked her up the road with the other at her elbow, steady as a banister, and he did not speak again until the chimneys of his own house came gray through the rain. That was the morning Eleanor Vane came to Ashcombe, and the household that received her did not know what to make of her at all. The housekeeper, a square and watchful woman named Mrs. Sten. Galt took one look at the wet, bleeding stranger in his Grace's own greatcoat and made a series of rapid private calculations, none of which she voiced. A girl was sent running for hot water and linen. Eleanor was installed in a small, warm room off the morning gallery, her wrist bound, her cut cleaned and closed with a neatness that suggested Mrs. Mellor. Galt had done such work before, and through all of it Eleanor kept apologizing, which seemed to irritate the housekeeper more than any rudeness could have. "You will stop saying you are sorry, Mrs. Ritt," Galt told her, wringing out a cloth pink with rinsed blood. "You went into a ditch through no fault of your own, and walked out of it on your own 2 feet. Well, 1 foot and 1 stocking. Sorry is for people who have done a wrong. You have only had one done to you." Eleanor looked at the woman's broad, capable hands and felt, for the first time in longer than she cared to measure, that someone in a house was on her side. She did not yet know how rare that feeling would prove, nor how dearly she would come to need the woman who had given it to her. Word was sent to Marrow Hill that the cousin they had summoned had met with an accident on the road and was recovering at Ashcombe under the Duke's roof. The reply, when it came 2 days later, was a marvel of careful unconcern. The Vanes were relieved to hear Miss Vane was not gravely hurt. They were certain the Duke's hospitality was more than she could have hoped for. They would expect her at Marrow Hill as soon as she was fit to travel and able to take up her duties, which were considerable, the household being short-handed and the season approaching. The letter did not ask how she did. It did not ask whether she could walk. It asked, in effect, when the convenience would resume being convenient. Gabriel read that letter over Mrs. Bashan, Galt's shoulder uninvited, because he had asked to be told the moment any word came from Marrow Hill, and he read it twice, and his jaw set in a way the housekeeper had not seen in 2 years. "Duties," he said. "She is to be sent down a county to scrub their grates and mind their guests, and they could not be troubled to send a man 5 miles to see whether she lived. It is not our affair, your Grace, Mrs. Blang." Galt said, which was both true and the opposite of what she felt. "No," he agreed. "It is not." And then he went and stood at the long window of his study for the better part of an hour, looking at nothing. And he did not give the order to ready a carriage for Miss Vane. And Mrs. Galt, who missed very little, noticed that too. Eleanor mended faster than she let on. Within a week she could walk the gallery without favoring the wrist, and she had begun, in the way of a woman constitutionally unable to be idle, to make herself useful in the small, invisible ways she had perfected over years of living on other people's sufferance. She mended a torn page in a book left open in the morning room, pressing the leaf flat and binding it with a thread of paste so neatly the repair could hardly be seen. She righted the music on the pianoforte that no one ever played. She learned the names of the underservants and used them. None of this was asked of her, and none of it was for thanks, and that though she did not know it, was exactly what made it visible to the one person in the house trained by sorrow to distrust everything done for thanks. There was a kitchen girl at Ashcombe named Bess, perhaps 13, all elbows and frightened silence, who had broken a good Sèvres dish in the 2nd week of Eleanor's stay, and stood white-faced in the passage waiting to be turned out for it. Eleanor found her there with the shards gathered in her apron and her chin trembling. And she did not lecture, and she did not soothe. She knelt on the cold flags in her one good gown and helped the child pick the last splinters from the stone, and she said, in a voice pitched only for the two of them, that a dish was a dish, and a girl was a girl, and that anyone who could not tell the difference between the two had no business keeping either. Then she took the broken pieces to Mrs. Galt herself, and laid the blame, falsely and flatly, upon her own clumsy bound wrist, and bore the housekeeper's sharp look without flinching, And the matter ended there. Bess never forgot it. Nor, as it happened, did the man who had come down the gallery on quiet boots for a book he did not especially want, and stopped at the turn of the passage, and stood unseen in the shadow of the great clock, while a poor relation with no portion and no protector took a servant's punishment upon herself for nothing, for no audience, for no advantage the world could name. He went away again without his book. He had seen what he had come without knowing it, to see. For Gabriel Thorne had not always been the recluse of Ashcombe. 2 years before, he had been a married man. His wife, Lady Cecily, had been the brightest creature in any room she entered, and she had died in the overturning of a curricle. He had been too proud and too distracted to insist she not drive herself on a fine dry day with no rain at all to blame, and he had not been there. He had been in London on business he could no longer even remember the substance of. He had received the news by letter, the way one receives news of a stranger, and the letter had been folded and unfolded so many times in the months after that it had worn soft as cloth, and he carried it still in the breast pocket of every coat he owned. He had decided, in the cold aftermath, that a man who could be absent at such a moment had forfeited the right to be present anywhere, and he had withdrawn from the world as a kind of sentence served. He had let the gardens go to seed, and the music stop, and the great rooms close one by one. And he had told himself this was penance when it was only hiding, and the difference between the two had stopped mattering to him a long time ago. A woman standing in the rain by a wrecked carriage, looking down an empty road for the help that did not come, had walked directly into the center of the one wound he had spent 2 years learning to walk around. He did not tell her this. He told no one this. Yet it changed the way he watched her. And Eleanor, who had spent her life being not watched, began to feel the difference without understanding it. The change announced itself first as a series of small commands she did not know how to read. "You will not carry that," he said, taking a scuttle of coal from her hands in the gallery, though carrying coal was precisely the sort of thing she had been summoned to Marrow Hill to do. "Sit by the fire, not the window," he said one gray afternoon. "The draught from that glass would fell a grenadier." And once finding her at the pianoforte with her hands resting on the keys but not playing, he said only, "Play it, if you wish. The instrument is wasted otherwise." And then he left the room before she could refuse, so that she was alone with the open lid and the permission. And after a long while she played. Badly, at first, and then less badly, the first music that House had heard in 2 years. She read every one of these commands as the impatience of a great man inconvenienced by a stranger underfoot. She could read them no other way. Her wound told her plainly that she was a burden being managed, and her wound had never yet been wrong. The audience to her life, had there been one, would have seen what she could not. That a man who has decided to be absent from the world does not take the coal from a poor relation's hands, that he does not learn which window drafts, that he does not stand outside a morning-room door listening to clumsy music, as though it were the most necessary sound he had heard in years. There was an evening in that quiet stretch that neither of them spoke of afterward, and neither of them forgot. The light had gone early, the way it does before snow, and Eleanor had come into the library to return a borrowed volume and found him already there, alone at the cold hearth with no candle lit, a single branch of light at the far table doing very little against the dusk. She would have withdrawn. She had her hand on the door. He said without turning, "Stay! Sit! You need not talk." And because the command left her nothing to refuse, she sat in the chair across from his, and the fire was built up by a footman, and the room came slowly warm, and for the better part of an hour neither of them said a word. She was aware of him the whole of that hour, with a precision she could not account for. Aware of exactly where his hands rested on the arms of the chair, of the line of his shoulder against the failing window, of the moment his breathing changed when the wind found the glass. Her own pulse betrayed her in the silence, quick and high in her throat, and she pressed her bound wrist into her lap as though she could hold her body still by holding the one part of it she could reach. He turned his head once and looked at her across the small distance, and the look held a beat past anything she could explain away, and she dropped her eye to the fire, because she did not dare keep them where they were. When the clock struck, and she rose to go, he rose too. And at the door he said only, "Good night, Miss Vane," in a voice gone rough at the edges, and she carried the roughness of it up the stairs, and lay awake a long while turning it over, telling herself it was nothing, knowing in her body that it was not. The trouble, when it came from Marrow Hill, and it came in the person of Lady Marbury, the Duke's nearest neighbor of consequence, and the self-appointed conscience of the district, who arrived at Ashcombe in her own carriage on the first fine day, in a fortnight, with the stated purpose of inquiring after his Grace's health, the unstated purpose of discovering the truth of a rumor she found intolerable. A young woman, unmarried, recovering for above a week, under the roof of the most eligible widower in 3 counties, with no chaperone but a housekeeper. Lady Marbury had brought her own granddaughter, Miss Augusta Finch, freshly out and freshly diamonded, expressly so that the comparison might be made and the correct conclusion drawn. "My dear Duke," Lady Marbury said, settled in the best chair in the drawing-room, with Augusta arranged at her side, like a well-dressed argument, "you must allow an old friend of your mother's to speak plainly, for no one else will dare. This person you have taken in. I do not doubt your charity, but charity has a shape, and this has rather lost its shape, has it not? A governess, or near enough, a girl with no people to speak of, no portion, nothing, kept on and on. People are beginning to say things, and the things they say do not flatter, whatever they may make of you." "And what is it?" Gabriel said in a voice that had gone very quiet. "That people are beginning to say." Lady Marbury fluttered her fan. "Pleased to be asked." "Only that you have got yourself a poor little adventuress, your Grace, a clever nobody who fell conveniently into your ditch. One pities her, of course. Purrs. But one cannot pretend she is anything. She is not." The words reached Eleanor in the doorway, where she had come with a tray of the tea Mrs. Galt was short-handed to carry, and she stood very still and let them land. A poor little adventuress, a clever nobody. She had been called worse, and by people with more right, and she set the tray down on the side table without rattling a single cup, which she counted, privately, as a kind of victory. Her hand, however, when she lifted it from the tray, was not quite steady, and across the room a pair of grey eyes marked the tremor, and the iron control laid over it both at once, and the Duke of Ashcombe rose from his chair. He did not, however, say the thing the moment seemed to demand. He had learned long ago that the surest way to confirm a rumor was to defend against it loudly. Instead, he crossed the room, and he took the tray from the side table himself, and he poured the tea with his own hands, the Duke of Ashcombe serving a poor relation in front of Lady Marbury and her diamonded granddaughter, and the act said in silence what no speech could have said as well. Lady Marbury's fan stopped moving. Augusta looked from the Duke to the plain young woman by the door and back again, and something uneasy crossed her pretty face, the first crack in a confidence that had never before met an obstacle. "Miss Vane is my guest," Gabriel said at last, handing the old woman her cup. "While she is under my roof, she will be addressed as a guest. I am certain you will both wish to set the example. It was not a defense. It was an instruction, and Lady Marbury, who understood instructions, took her granddaughter and her wounded dignity home within the half-hour. She did not, however, take her conclusions with her. She left them at Marrow Hill on her way past, in the form of a brisk and confidential call upon the Vanes, in which she expressed her grave concern for their cousin's reputation, and her even graver concern for their family's name, and the Vanes, who had not wanted Eleanor, returned so much as they had wanted her not to be a bother. Discovered all at once that she had become a bother of the most expensive kind. That was how the letter came. That changed everything. It arrived at Ashcombe, addressed to Eleanor in her cousin Harold Vane's hand, and she read it alone in her small warm room, and the warmth went out of the day. The family had reconsidered her situation. Given the talk now circulating, And given that a young woman of no fortune could not be permitted to trade further on a great man's charity without ruin, they had taken the liberty of securing her future. A match had been arranged. A Mr. E. Crail, a widowed corn factor of middle age and ample means in the next county, had agreed to take her without a portion, on the understanding that she would come to him directly and quietly, and trouble no one further. She was to be ready to travel within the week. It was, the letter assured her, more than a girl in her position had any right to expect, and she would oblige the family by being grateful. Eleanor sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. She did not weep, because she had taught herself not to weep where she might be heard. And the habit held even here where no one was listening. She understood the shape of the thing exactly. She was to be removed, and the removal dressed as rescue. And the man who would receive her had asked nothing of her but that she be quiet and useful and require no love, which was, she reflected, only the bargain she had been offered all her life with the pretense at last stripped away. She folded the letter along its worn creases. She thought, against her own will, of the weight of a borrowed greatcoat settling around her shoulders in the rain, and she put the thought away, because that warmth had never been meant for her, and she would not disgrace herself by pretending it had. She found the Duke in the library at the gray end of the afternoon, and she told him plainly, because she had decided that the cleanest cut was the kindest, that she would be leaving Ashcombe within the week, that her family had arranged a marriage, and that she was grateful, deeply and truly grateful, for his great kindness to a stranger. She got the speech out without her voice breaking, which she had practiced. She watched it land. He was standing by the tall window, and he did not turn for a moment. When he did, his face had gone to the carved stillness she had seen the first morning on the road. "A marriage," he said. "To whom? A Mr. Crail. A respectable man. A corn factor. You do not know him." "I do not need to know him," Eleanor said. And now the steadiness cost her something. "I am 24, your grace, with no portion and no people who want me, and a roof has been offered, and a position, and a name. Women in my situation do not marry men, they know. We marry the roof. I have understood that for a long time. I should be foolish to expect otherwise. And I am not a foolish woman." "No," he said. "You are not." And then, very low, the words level, the way a struck bell is level after the strike. "Is it what you want?" The question undid her in a way the letter had not. No one had asked her that. In 24 years, no one had asked her what she wanted. Because what she wanted had never once been a term in the bargain, and the fact that he asked it now, this cold, withdrawn man who owed her nothing, broke something open that she had kept sealed her whole life. She did not answer it. She could not. She said, instead, the only thing her control would permit, which was the truth turned just far enough aside to be bearable. "What I want has never signified, your grace." It would be a cruelty to begin asking now. And she left the room before he could see what asking had done to her face. Stay with her here, because this is the hour the whole story has been walking toward, though neither of them knew it yet. What she did not see was that a cold man's question is the most expensive thing he owns. The night before she was to leave, Ashcombe gave a dinner. It had not given a dinner in 2 years, and the suddenness of it set the county talking before the invitations were cold, for the Duke of Ashcombe did not entertain, and that he should choose to do so on the very eve of dispatching his charity case to her corn factor was read by Lady Marbury as a graceful capitulation, and by Mrs. Galt, who had her own ideas, as something else entirely. Perquet. The great dining room that seated 30 was opened and aired and filled with candlelight, and the families of consequence came, the Marburys foremost among them. Augusta, in ice blue and diamonds, and a Mr. Botta. Crail, summoned by the Vanes, and present at the Duke's own invitation. A heavy, careful man who looked at Eleanor the way a buyer looks at livestock he has already paid for. The Vanes came too, Harold Vane, unctuous and uneasy, and Eleanor was seated, by the Duke's express arrangement, not below the salt with the dependents, but at his own right hand, which scandalized the table, and which she bore with a composure that cost her every resource she had. The talk at such a table was a kind of weather, and the weather turned against her by the second remove. It was Lady Marbury who began it, as Lady Marbury began most things, with the air of a woman performing a public service. "Mr. Crail," she said, pitching her voice for the whole table, "you are to be congratulated on your charity, sir, in taking on a young woman with so very little to recommend her beyond a willing pair of hands. A poor little adventuress, the world would call her, though I am sure you will manage her admirably." The table went still. There it was a second time, in the same 3 counties' worth of company. The label fastened in public where the first time it had been fastened in a drawing-room. Mr. Crail gave a wet, complacent laugh, and allowed that he had always found a grateful wife, the most economical kind. Harold Vane studied his plate. And Eleanor, seated at the right hand of the Duke of Ashcombe, kept her eyes on the candle before her, and felt her own pulse in her throat, and did not look up, because if she looked up, the table would see her face, and she would not give them her face. What happened next happened slowly, the way the largest things do. The Duke of Ashcombe set down his glass. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Lady Marbury, or at Crail, or at the staring table. He looked only at the woman beside him, and when he spoke it was to her, in the level, quiet voice that carried the length of that silent room, exactly because it was so quiet. "Eleanor," he said, and the use of her given name went through the company, like a draught through a candle flame, for no one had heard him call her anything but Miss Vane. "I have a question I should have asked you in the library, and put badly, and I will ask it better now, before these witnesses, so that it cannot be unsaid." He rose. The whole table rose with their eyes. He turned to face her fully, and the candlelight fell at last across the whole of his face, the carved stillness gone and something far more dangerous beneath it, and into the held silence of 30 staring people he said, the thing that ended the matter. "Marry me. Eleanor, not the roof. Me." The room did not breathe. Mr. Crail's complacent face went slack. Harold Vane half rose and sat again. And Lady Marbury, the great arbiter of the district, opened her mouth and found, for the first time in her long career of pronouncements, that she had nothing whatever to say. Her fan frozen at the height she had held it her whole life, the height from which she had judged 100 lesser women, and never once been judged in return. Augusta, in her ice blue and her diamonds, looked at the plain young woman in the gray gown at the Duke's right hand, and the uneasy thing that had crossed her face at Ashcombe a week before settled now into something almost like relief, the relief of a girl released from a part she had never wanted to play. Eleanor sat very still in the eye of all of it. When she finally spoke, her voice was not steady at all, and she did not try to make it so, and that, after a lifetime of steadiness, was the most truthful thing she had ever done. "You do not know what you are doing," she said. "These people will say you have ruined yourself." "These people," the Duke said, "have said a great many things. They were wrong about every one of them, and they have been wrong, I find, about you, longest of all." He held out his hand to her across the small distance that had become the only distance in the room that mattered. "I was not there once," he said, lower now, "for her, and not for them, though the silence carried it anyway. When a carriage went into a wall and a woman needed someone to come, I have lived 2 years inside that failure. I came down the Marrow Road by accident on the worst morning of your life, and I have decided I do not believe in the accident. I came. I am still coming. Say yes, and I will spend the rest of my life being the man who came." And the worn, soft letter he had carried in his breast pocket for 2 years, the letter that had told him of a death he had not been present for, he took out now, in front of all of them, and set upon the table, face down, the way a man lays down a card he no longer needs, or a burden he is at last permitted to put down. Mrs. Galt, standing at the sideboard with the decanter forgotten in her hand, understood the gesture before anyone else in the room, and her square, capable face crumpled and recovered in the space of a breath. Eleanor took his hand. She would never afterward be able to say which of them had moved first. Only that the cold of 2 years and the cold of 24 came together over a dinner table at Ashcombe, and made, against every law the district lived by, a single warmth between them. The procedural machinery that the hierarchy had set so confidently against her unwound within the week. For a duke's intention is its own authority, and the corn factor was paid off his disappointment and sent home, and the Vanes discovered that a cousin they had counted as a debt had become, overnight, the most advantageous connection their grasping family had ever stumbled into, and bore the reversal with the shamelessness of people to whom shame had always been a foreign country. Lady Marbury called once more at Ashcombe, much subdued, and was received with a courtesy so perfect it was its own correction, and went away, understanding, as such women eventually do, that the verdict of the world is only ever on loan from people who will one day be proven wrong. They were married quietly in the small grey church at the edge of the Ashcombe grounds before snow, with Mrs. Galt weeping frankly in the front pew and the under-servants whose names Eleanor had learned crowded gladly at the back. There was no diamonded company. There was no audience to perform for. There was only a plain ceremony for 2 people who had each been written off by a world that kept the wrong ledger, and the new entry that ceremony made could not be unmade by anyone. The first snow of the year came on Christmas Eve, and it came down soft and steady over Ashcombe, through the short grey afternoon, and into the dark. Eleanor stood at the tall library window where she had once delivered a speech about marrying roofs, and she watched the white come down over the grounds that were hers, now over the grey church where she had been given a name that no one could take back, and she felt her husband come and stand behind her, his hands settling at her shoulders, the way the borrowed greatcoat had settled there, once in the rain, warm and heavy, and meant, this time, entirely for her. On the small table by the window lay the soft, worn letter, no longer carried, no longer needed, kept now not as a sentence but as a thing survived. Beside it, where Eleanor had set it that morning, lay the grey travelling glove she had been wearing the day the carriage went into the wall, the one she had kept without quite knowing why, the single object she had carried out of the wreck of her old life into this one. She did not need to explain it to him. He knew already what it was to keep the thing that marked the worst morning, and to learn, slowly, to keep it for a different reason. Behind them the fire moved in the grate, and the pianoforte stood open where she had taken to playing it every evening, a phrase of something left unfinished on the stand for the morning. Somewhere in the house, Mrs. Galt was scolding a footman with great affection. The snow came down. The road beyond the hedgerows, the road where she had once stood alone and waited for help that did not come, lay quiet and white and entirely unimportant now, a place she had passed through, on her way to here. "You came," Eleanor said, watching the snow, the words so quiet, they were almost only breath. "I am still coming," said the Duke of Ashcombe, and drew his wife back against him, and the 2 of them stood a long while at the window of the house that had become, against every expectation either of them had been permitted, a home. "Thank you for staying with Eleanor all the way to the snow. If her long walk up that empty road moved you, I would be glad to know it."